11:21 at night. October 23, 2019. Auburn, Alabama. A 19-year-old walks into a Chevron gas station on South College Street. She's 2 minutes from her apartment. She's here for something small, a bag of chips. The kind of stop that happens without a second thought, 100 times a night, in 100 towns just like this one. The camera above the register catches her moving through the aisles. Unhurried. Unremarkable. If you didn't know what came next, you'd forget you ever saw it. 2 minutes. That's all that stood between her and home. She never covered them. Her name is Aniah Blanchard. She does not come home that night. By morning, her roommate notices the silence. By afternoon, her family is driving toward Auburn, retracing streets, searching yards, refusing to accept what every hour of silence is telling them. Within days, a car is found, 60 miles from where she was last seen, damaged, empty. Within a week, federal agencies are involved. Within 2, a face investigators had overlooked in hours of surveillance footage suddenly has a name. What happened to Aniah Blanchard in the hours after she left that gas station has taken years to fully answer, and parts of it, even now, remain contested in a courtroom. Who else was standing in that store with her that night, close enough to be caught on the very same camera? Why did it take investigators nearly 2 weeks to see what had been recorded the whole time? And what was inside her car that turned a missing person report into a homicide investigation in less than 72 hours? This is the story of an ordinary Wednesday night, and of how far one family was willing to go to make sure it wasn't forgotten.
We're going to get justice. Might not be this year, but maybe next year, but we are going to get justice for Aniah. And until we do, we're not going to give up fighting. We're still going to fight. We're still going to remember her every time we get a chance, and even after that.
Long before any of this, Aniah Haley Blanchard was, in the words of nearly everyone who ever spoke about her afterward. Born June 22, 2000, and raised in Homewood, Alabama, she grew up in a large, blended family. Her mother, Angela Haley Harris, was a registered nurse. Her father, Elijah Blanchard Sr., was a Birmingham businessman. Her mother later married Walt Harris, a heavyweight fighter in the UFC, which meant Aniah's world stretched across 2 households, a stepfamily, half-siblings, and a wide circle of cousins. By every account, she was the one who held it all together. She was the glue to our family, her mother would say years later. She held us all together. At Homewood High School, Aniah played softball, and not as a background player. Her coach, Tiffany Statham, remembered her as team captain and an impact player, someone who found a way to contribute no matter the situation. At the end of her senior season, she received the Patriot Award, given to the player who best embodies character and leadership. Another coach, Amy Letson, recalled her crossing over after a game to tell the losing team she was proud of how hard they'd worked. Friends remembered a similar spirit outside of softball, active in her church community, split between Trinity United Methodist and Church of the Highlands, and known for what one friend called a positive, eternal mindset. By the fall of 2019, Aniah was studying early childhood education at Southern Union State Community College in Lee County, planning to transfer to Auburn University and eventually become a teacher, and, friends said, a coach in her own right. She babysat regularly for a family in the area, and had a dog, Blue, sometimes recorded in press coverage as Blue, who, her mother would later note, was never once left alone overnight. Not by Aniah. Not ever. None of this made her famous. It made her, in the description her mother would return to again and again in the years that followed, almost perfect, not because she was without flaws, but because of how completely she was loved. On the night of October 23, 2019, none of that mattered yet to the people who didn't know her. To them, she was about to become a name on a missing person report. To her family, she was about to become the reason they stopped sleeping. Public reporting does not offer a detailed account of Aniah's movements in the days before October 23. No source has reconstructed that earlier week in the way investigators would eventually reconstruct her final hours. What's confirmed narrows quickly to that Wednesday night. Some contemporaneous local reporting states that, just before midnight, Aniah spoke by phone with a friend
and Homeland Security are all helping with the search. Authorities found her SUV, but no sign of the young woman.
Separately,
about 50 miles away from her home in the parking lot of this apartment complex in Montgomery, Alabama. The front right side was covered in scratches and dents.
Later reviewed the messages at trial. The exchange referenced Aniah spending time with a man named Eric. The precise wording of those messages, and how the phone call and the Snapchat exchange relate to each other, has never been fully reconciled across every account of that night. What is consistent is this: Aniah told the people closest to her, in her own words, that she had just met someone. That single detail, a first name that would turn out to lead nowhere, is what her roommate and family had to work with in the earliest hours of her disappearance. It would take investigators weeks to determine that Eric was not the name of the man who had actually crossed paths with her that night. Nothing about the evening, as reconstructed from what's publicly known, suggested urgency or fear. A college student, driving her own car, texting her roommate, stopping for a snack 2 minutes from home. It reads, in every account, like an unremarkable Wednesday night in a college town. It would not stay that way. And the next few hours are the last hours anyone would ever be able to fully account for. At 11:21 p.m., Aniah pulled into the Chevron at the corner of South College Street and East University Drive. She wasn't alone in the store. Surveillance footage, reviewed by police, though not made public until days later, shows another figure inside at the same time, a man buying alcohol, appearing to glance in her direction. At this point in the investigation, he is simply a stranger who happened to be standing in the same aisle. Investigators wouldn't know his name for another 2 weeks. According to footage later reviewed at trial, that same man was seen exiting the passenger side of Aniah's vehicle at the Chevron, and then, at a second gas station nearby, re-entering the passenger seat. From that second location, the footage reportedly shows the two of them leaving together. One witness who was at the Chevron that night later told police he believed he'd seen a man force Aniah into her own vehicle. According to that witness's account, he mentioned it to a companion that same night, and was told it wasn't his business. To be clear about what this is, one witness's recollection, delivered to investigators after the fact, not something police observed themselves. Years later, at trial, other witnesses who were also at the gas station that night would testify they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual at all. The accounts don't fully agree, and that disagreement would matter enormously, years later, in a Macon County courtroom. The trail, though, keeps going. An automated license plate reader near Interstate 85, just south of Veterans Boulevard, captured Aniah's black 2017 Honda CR-V heading south at 12:34 a.m., likely toward Montgomery. It is the last confirmed location of her vehicle in motion. Her phone was never recovered. Investigators say they were able to trace some of its movement through call records, but the device itself, and whatever it might have held, disappeared along with her. The bag of chips she bought that night would turn out to be the last ordinary thing she ever did. 2 minutes from home. She never made those 2 minutes. By the time the sun came up on October 24th, nobody yet knew to call this a crime. They only knew that a young woman who had told her roommate she was almost home had gone completely silent. And silence, as her family was about to learn, moves a lot faster than answers. Sarah noticed first. Aniah hadn't come home, and it wasn't like her. Sarah called Aniah's brother, Elijah Jr. He called Karina Thomas, the woman Aniah babysat for, and learned Aniah hadn't shown up for work that morning either. That was the detail that changed everything. Elijah called their mother and stepfather with 4 words, "Aniah's missing." Angela Harris and Walt Harris got in the car immediately and drove to Auburn. Once there, they searched the way parents search when official channels feel too slow, driving block by block, checking yards, appealing directly to the public. Angela Harris kept returning to one fact that told her, with total certainty, that something was wrong. Aniah had left her dog alone overnight. It was something her daughter simply did not do. On October 24, Auburn police took a formal missing person report. Within days, this stopped being a family's private fear and became a regional story, then a national one. On the night of October 25, Aniah's black Honda CR-V was found abandoned at an apartment complex on Boardwalk Boulevard in Montgomery, roughly 50 to 60 miles from where she'd last been seen. The vehicle was damaged. Investigators said the damage had occurred sometime in the 2 days since she'd last been seen. Evidence was recovered from inside. For a family already living on almost no sleep, this was the moment the ground shifted again. A car that, far from home, visibly damaged, told its own story before a single lab result came back. Sit with that for a moment. A missing person case is, at its core, a case built on hope, the hope that someone simply hasn't checked in yet. A damaged, abandoned car 60 miles from home doesn't erase that hope. But it changes its shape. From this point on, everyone's searching for Aniah Blanchard, her family, the volunteers who hadn't even arrived yet, the officers filing the report, was searching for her under a different, heavier kind of urgency. The public response was immediate and, because of who Aniah's stepfather was, unusually large. Governor Kay Ivey authorized an initial $5,000 reward. Contributions from UFC President Dana White, fighter John Jones, Dominance MMA's Ali Abdulaziz, and an anonymous Homewood family pushed the total past $105,000 within days. On November 2, Tim Miller, founder of Texas EquuSearch, met with Auburn Police Chief Paul Register. Miller's organization had searched for missing people worldwide, including, 14 years earlier, less than 5 miles from where Aniah grew up, a Mountain Brook teenager named Natalie Holloway, who vanished on a graduation trip to Aruba in 2005 and was never found. And then came a detail that stopped a lot of people cold. Beth Holloway, Natalie's mother, personally joined the search for Aniah. A woman who had spent 14 years without an answer of her own was now walking through Alabama woods and fields, looking for someone else's daughter. The search itself was daunting by design. Auburn's police chief said investigators were focused on the corridor between Auburn and Montgomery, roughly 50 miles of highway, back roads, and open land. A director with EquuSearch's Midwest chapter described it more bluntly: a 50-mile stretch investigators had to look outside the box to cover, on foot, in vehicles, and in the air. On November 12, EquuSearch suspended its ground search, not because the case had gone cold, but because Alabama's hunting season was beginning, and the organization judged the woods too dangerous for volunteers to be moving through unannounced. There's something haunting in that, the possibility that Aniah could be found not by a trained team, but by a hunter moving through the same woods for an entirely different reason. The group said as much publicly, urging people to keep sharing Aniah's information because so many missing people are ultimately found that way. Volunteers regrouped and returned to the search on November 15 and again in force in the days after. On October 30, formal recognition of what this had become arrived: a multi-agency task force, Auburn Police, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, began working the case together. Federal agencies don't attach themselves to a case because a college student is running late. They attach themselves when the evidence has already told investigators what they're truly looking for. On October 31, police said publicly what that evidence indicated: Aniah was a victim of foul play. 2 words that reframed everything that followed. On November 14, Angela Harris and Walt Harris appeared on the nationally syndicated Dr. Phil show, telling viewers directly that they believed Aniah's disappearance had been planned in advance. It was, for a case that had already gone national, a moment that pushed her face and her story in front of an audience of millions who had never heard her name before that morning. Investigators now had a task force, a 50-mile search corridor, a car that told them something terrible had happened, and a missing person who had, by every account, done nothing to invite what came next. What they still didn't have was a face. That was about to change, and it had been sitting on a surveillance tape from the very first night. On October 28, 5 days after Aniah vanished, Auburn police released the Chevron surveillance footage to the public, the final video anyone would ever see of her alive, walking calmly through a gas station just before midnight. It became, almost instantly, the emotional center of the entire case. 3 days later, confirmation arrived from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. Evidence recovered from inside Aniah's car indicated she had been seriously harmed. According to a later affidavit, blood found in the front passenger seat was described in stark, clinical terms, indicative of someone suffering a life-threatening injury. Testing would eventually confirm that blood was Aniah's own. There was something else investigators noticed when the vehicle was recovered, something that wouldn't become public until testimony years later at trial. 2 officers who processed the car said they detected what smelled like hand sanitizer inside it, a detail prosecutors would eventually argue pointed to an attempt to erase evidence from the vehicle's surfaces. And there was a puzzle buried in what investigators didn't find. There was no DNA, no fingerprints beyond Aniah's own, on key surfaces of the car. To some, that might have suggested the case would stall. Prosecutors would later argue the opposite, that the absence of a second person's trace evidence was itself a kind of evidence, consistent with someone who understood exactly what he needed to wipe away, and who wasn't concerned about blood that wasn't his. Investigators had a damaged vehicle. Blood consistent with a life-threatening injury. An interior that looked deliberately cleaned. 12 days into the case, they still lacked one thing: the second person who'd been in that car. The answer had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, on the Chevron's own cameras, from the very first night. On November 6, Auburn police released images pulled from the Chevron surveillance system, not of Aniah, but of another customer captured in the store at the same time. They called him, carefully, a person of interest, and asked the public for help identifying him. It took less than a day. Detectives already knew one thing about him before they knew his name: he wasn't just another customer. He was the last person known to leave with Aniah Blanchard. On November 7, police named him Ibrahim Yazd, 29 or 30 years old, reporting at the time varied, of Montgomery, Alabama, with what police described as a lengthy arrest record. The footage, once investigators focused on it, told a more specific story than a stranger buying alcohol. Yazd was seen exiting the passenger side of Aniah's vehicle at the Chevron. Footage from a second gas station reportedly shows him re-entering the passenger seat, and the two of them leaving together. His history, laid out afterward in court records and reporting, was extensive. At the time Aniah disappeared, Yazd was free on a $295,000 bond tied to a January 2019 incident in Montgomery, in which he and others allegedly held 2 men in a hotel room against their will. One victim, 77 years old, was left, according to court records cited by reporters, unconscious, unresponsive, and near death, and robbed of a watch, weapons, his wallet, and cash. The other man was also beaten and robbed. Those charges included kidnapping, robbery, and attempted murder. Public records separately reference a 2017 arrest for battery on a police officer, and an allegation from 2012 that he attempted to strike 2 officers with a vehicle. None of those earlier cases were tied by evidence to what happened to Aniah. They establish only what the public record shows: a man with a documented history of serious violence, free on bond, standing in the same gas station as a 19-year-old buying chips. Once Yazd's name went public, the case moved fast, and it moved south, toward Florida. According to later reporting, a tip led investigators to the Pine Forest Road exit off Interstate 10 near Pensacola. When members of a regional fugitive task force made contact, Yazd reportedly fled on foot and refused to comply with commands before a physical struggle with law enforcement ended in his arrest. Sources differ slightly on the exact hour. One contemporaneous timeline places the arrest just before midnight on November 7, others cite November 8 or 9. What's consistent is that he was in custody within roughly a day of being publicly named, initially on a first-degree kidnapping charge. He appeared in a Florida court before being extradited to Alabama. The investigation widened further. On November 20th, at a hearing in Opelika, Auburn Police Detective Josh Mixon testified about the account of the witness who believed he'd seen someone force Aniah into her car, the first time that account entered the public record in detail. 2 more people were arrested in the following days, though their roles in the case, and their fates, turned out to be far more complicated than the initial charges suggested. On November 22, Antoine Squirmy Fisher, 35, was taken into custody in Montgomery and charged with first-degree kidnapping, on the belief he had provided transportation to Yazd and helped dispose of evidence. Prosecutors noted in court that Fisher had a documented violent history of his own, a 2006 guilty plea to murder in an unrelated drug-related case, for which he'd served roughly 3 years under a split sentence. Then, on November 25, David Johnson Jr. was arrested and charged with hindering prosecution. An affidavit alleged he had lied to investigators about his son's alleged role in driving Yazd toward Florida. That same day, November 25, more than a month after Aniah disappeared, searchers found human remains in a wooded area off Macon County Road 2, not far from a church called New Hope Baptist. Lee County District Attorney Brandon Hughes said he had strong reason to believe the remains were Aniah's. 2 days later, on November 27, the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences confirmed it through DNA testing. The cause of death, an autopsy determined, was a gunshot wound. Here the case takes one of its more difficult turns to reconcile. In December 2019, Lee County prosecutors moved to dismiss the kidnapping charge against Fisher, not because he'd been cleared of involvement, but on what District Attorney Hughes described as legal and jurisdictional grounds. None of Fisher's alleged actions had occurred in Lee County, and prosecutors determined his conduct didn't meet Alabama's legal threshold for accomplice liability as originally charged. A judge granted the dismissal on December 17. According to later reporting, the hindering prosecution charge against Johnson was also eventually dismissed. Yazd, prosecutors said at the time, was the only person they believed had been directly involved in Aniah's abduction and killing, even as Fisher's account of that night would go on to become central to the case against him. Because in June 2020, in an interview with investigators that would resurface at trial nearly 6 years later, Fisher gave a detailed account of the hours after Aniah disappeared, describing Yazd arriving at a Montgomery home before dawn on October 24, Aniah's vehicle parked nearby, a stop for gasoline, a trip to retrieve what Fisher described as an assault rifle, and a drive north toward Shorter, near where Aniah's remains were later found. It was, by Fisher's own account, testimony that placed him at the edges of the worst hours of the case, testimony the defense would later attack precisely because it came from a man with his own history and his own reasons to cooperate. On December 2, prosecutors upgraded the charges against Yazd from kidnapping to capital murder and announced they would seek the death penalty. He maintained his innocence and was held without bond in the Lee County Jail. Just weeks later, on December 21, nearly 2,000 people gathered in Birmingham for a memorial service. Mourners wore baby blue, Aniah's favorite color. Her godbrother, Noah Whale, played a guitar tribute before speaking about what her presence had meant to him. Her cousin, Hannah Haley, described a light that people wanted to be around. Homewood's mayor declared December 21 Aniah Haley Blanchard Day, and the superintendent of Homewood Schools announced a scholarship would be created in her name. The search was over. So, in its most urgent sense, was the investigation. The legal case, and a fight over the law itself, had barely begun. It would take more than 6 years to reach a verdict. What followed Aniah's death was not a quick resolution. It was a legal process that stretched from December 2019 into the spring of 2026, long enough for the case to outlive multiple trial dates, and long enough for it to change Alabama law before it ever reached a jury. That's because Aniah's family didn't wait for a verdict to start fighting. Because Yazd had been free on bond at the time, investigators say he killed her, despite facing kidnapping and attempted murder charges in an unrelated case. Angela Harris and Walt Harris became the public face of a push to change Alabama's bail system. Under the state constitution, nearly every defendant has a right to bail except those facing capital charges. The proposed law, named for Aniah, would let prosecutors request a hearing to deny bail to defendants accused of a defined list of serious violent crimes, kidnapping, rape, murder, human trafficking, and others, if a judge found them a flight risk or a danger to the community. The bill moved through Alabama's legislature with a speed and unanimity rarely seen for any piece of legislation, passing both chambers almost unanimously. Governor Kay Ivey signed it in June 2021. Because it amended the state constitution, it then went before voters directly, and in November 2022, Alabama voters overwhelmingly approved it. The criminal case moved on a far slower track. A 2020 preliminary hearing settled a jurisdictional dispute over where Yazd could be tried, sending the case to a Lee County grand jury. He wasn't formally indicted until November 2022, on 3 counts of capital murder. He pleaded not guilty in March 2023. The trial itself was delayed repeatedly over the following years before finally beginning in March 2026, more than 6 years after Aniah disappeared, in Macon County, the jurisdiction where her remains were found. Over more than a week of testimony, prosecutors built their case around the surveillance footage from both gas stations, cell phone data tracing a route through Montgomery and up Interstate 85 toward Macon County in the hours after Aniah disappeared, and witness testimony, including Fisher's own account of that morning, and 2 additional witnesses who said they'd seen Yazd in a car resembling Aniah's hours after she went missing. Prosecutors argued Aniah was shot in the passenger seat of her own vehicle sometime after 12:34 a.m., then driven into the Macon County woods. The defense pushed back hard on the state's key witnesses, both convicted felons, as defense attorneys repeatedly reminded the jury, arguing the case rested on short video clips, a Snapchat exchange referencing a man named Eric, and testimony that had shifted over the years. If a struggle over a firearm had led to an accidental discharge, the defense argued, that was a different crime than the calculated capital murder prosecutors were asking the jury to find. On March 17, the 3rd capital charge, tied to the vehicle itself, was dropped, leaving 2 counts for the jury, kidnapping and robbery, each carrying lesser included offenses down to manslaughter. After roughly a day and a half of deliberation, spread across March 18 and 19, the jury reached its verdict on March 19, 2026, guilty of felony murder under the kidnapping count, and guilty of murder under the robbery count, both lesser offenses than the capital murder charges the state had sought. Jurors, applying Alabama's sentencing framework, found Yazd had intended to rob Aniah but had not originally set out to kidnap her, a distinction with enormous legal weight. One word on that verdict sheet made all the difference. For Aniah's family, 6 years of waiting came down to that single distinction. Without a capital conviction, the death penalty was no longer possible. In the courtroom, the moment landed hard on everyone in the gallery. Aniah's family held each other. Across the room, so did Yazd's. Angela Harris and Walt Harris were seen afterward walking out of the courthouse together, holding hands. Attorney General Steve Marshall, whose office had prosecuted the case, said his office was disappointed the verdict foreclosed the death penalty, but pledged to seek the maximum sentence available, and to make sure Yazd spent the rest of his life in prison. That sentencing came on May 7, 2026, before Special Judge Tom Young Jr. in Macon County. Before the sentence was handed down, Aniah's parents and stepfather addressed the court directly. Angela Harris described her daughter in words she'd use nowhere else: "She was my mini-me. She was my twin. She was my best friend." She told the court Aniah had loved children, animals, and her younger siblings fiercely, and that she had been living, thriving, with dreams and a future, long before any of what happened to her. Her father, Aniah Blanchard Sr., spoke about birthdays without her and empty chairs at holidays, closing with a line that captured 6 years of grief distilled into 4 words: "She mattered." Walt Harris told the court he made a point of looking Yates directly in the eyes while he spoke, determined, he said afterward, to make sure Yates understood he hadn't won. Judge Young sentenced Yates to life in prison on both counts, the maximum the law allowed him. He remains eligible for parole. The defense had 42 days to appeal and said it intended to. More than 6 years after a 19-year-old stopped for a bag of chips, a Macon County courtroom had finally reached the end of its part of the story. Her family's part was far from over. Aniah's law didn't stop evolving once it passed in 2022. In 2026, an expansion appeared on Alabama's primary election ballot, asking voters to widen the list of crimes for which judges could deny bail, adding shooting into an occupied space, and the solicitation, attempt, or conspiracy to commit murder, to a list that already included kidnapping, rape, and human trafficking. A law that began as a response to one bond decision in one Montgomery courtroom was still, years later, being sharpened by the people who'd lived through what happens when it isn't strict enough. At home, Aniah's name took quieter, more permanent forms. Homewood Public Schools established a scholarship in her honor. In June 2020, a bench was dedicated to her at Patriot Park, its plaque reading simply, "In loving memory of Aniah Blanchard, friends and community." Her family created a non-profit, Aniah's Heart, dedicated to teaching self-defense and situational awareness, and advocating for the families of other missing people, describing itself, in Walt Harris's words, as a platform for the voiceless. Every October since 2019, her family and friends have gathered in Homewood to mark the anniversary of her disappearance, not, they've said, to relive the worst night of their lives, but to make sure her name keeps being said out loud. 5 years after she vanished, with the trial still delayed and unresolved, Angela Harris stood at one of those vigils and read the names of other victims of violence, refusing to let any of them be forgotten either. At the sentencing, more than 6 years after that night at the Chevron, Aniah Blanchard Sr. told the court that his daughter's name had been enough to secure a conviction, and that he was, in his own words, not a victim, but victorious, because victimhood would mean giving Yates power over his family that he refused to grant him. None of it brings her back. No verdict, no sentence, no law with her name attached undoes what her family lost on a Wednesday night in October 2019. But 6 years after a wooded area off a rural Macon County road gave up its answer, Aniah Blanchard's case reached what so many others never do: a courtroom, a jury, a sentence, and a piece of the Alabama Constitution that carries her name forward into every bond hearing that comes after hers. Picture her one more time, the way the camera saw her, a 19-year-old walking through a gas station just before midnight, in no hurry, thinking about nothing more than getting home to a dog who was waiting for her. That's where this story starts, and it's worth ending there too, because that is who Aniah Blanchard was before any of what followed. A daughter her mother called her twin. A team captain who told a losing opponent she was proud of them. A future teacher, 2 minutes from home, 2 years from finishing her degree. What happened to her afterward took a 50-mile search corridor, a multi-agency task force, a forensic lab, a mother who had lost her own daughter 14 years earlier walking through someone else's search field, and more than 6 years of courtrooms to even partially resolve. For investigators, this case became surveillance footage, DNA evidence, court testimony, a constitutional amendment, and 6 years of legal proceedings. For her family, it never stopped being something much simpler. A 19-year-old daughter who stopped to buy a bag of chips, 2 minutes from home. And never came home.